Hey guys, welcome back. I'm going to do an intro to this episode actually because we have a really exciting guest coming on, and she's going to talk about a really traumatic experience that she had over a period of 12 years. And the details of this trauma have been documented elsewhere, and I will tell you exactly where, but we didn't feel the need to make her recount them here. So I'm just going to kind of give the background and then we'll go into her interview. So the guest today is named Sarah Edmondson. You may know her from the HBO documentary series called The Vow. The Vow is the story of the takedown of this cult called Nxivm. And so naturally, our topic for today is cults. Probably not too many of you are in a cult or have friends who are in a cult, but why I think this topic is still important is a lot of the brainwashing she's going to describe is very reminiscent of emotional abuse in toxic relationships. So I think that this topic is actually much more relevant to us than it might at first seem. So I'm just going to kind of give a breakdown of what Nxivm was. Probably when most of you think about cults, you think of these like really weird, eccentric people, out in the desert somewhere, all drinking Kool-Aid together. But what's really unique about Nxivm is that this thing had thousands of members. Nxivm was visited by the Dalai Lama, essentially endorsed by the Dalai Lama. It had incredibly wealthy, successful, famous people as members. Since Nxivm was taken down in 2018, the leader of the whole thing, named Keith Raniere, has been sentenced to 250 years in prison. And his kind of second in command, Allison Mack, who you might know as a lead character in Smallville, has been sentenced to, I think, 3 years. And the Nxivm heiresses, so I don't know if any of you drink Nxivm's gin. It's my personal favorite brand, actually. They're also facing jail time. So this thing is very big and influenced so many people. And the way it did this was it all kind of operated under the guise of a self-help group. And so people were initially recruited into these workshops called executive success programs. So basically what happened to Sarah was she met a filmmaker that she was really inspired by named Mark Vicente. And he basically told her that the secret to his current success are these executive success programs, and he invited her to join. So she spends a couple $1,000s that she didn't have to go to this 5-day workshop, and she's skeptical at first, and it's kind of cheesy, but over the course of the 5 days, she has these epiphanies. The entire room is just changing. They're kind of in a flow together, and apparently the majority of people who would take these 5-day workshops found them extremely powerful, and then afterwards had this boost of confidence, boost of focus and productivity that really sucked them into this larger program. The problem with Nxivm is that a lot of the philosophies that they promoted were helpful in a sense, but they were also weaponized in order to brainwash people. And so as you get deeper into Nxivm, there's more classes, more courses. There are classes on, male and female dynamics that are quite stereotyped. There are training courses for if you're, an actor, you want greater success there. But the real problem is when you join the stripe path, which to me sounds very similar to how Scientology works. So basically, the stripe path is when you decide to get more involved in the community and you work your way up, eventually basically being employed by the company. And, they're through like a series of different colored sashes and stripes that designates your rank within the company and you get promoted. And as you get more and more powerful in this company, you're actually more and more disempowered because you're getting kind of closer to the heart of the beast. And at the very center was this group that evolved, I think in the late 2010s, called DOS. And DOS was supposedly a women's only group bent on empowering each other, sticking to their commitments, and changing the world. And Sarah was actually approached by her best friend of many, many years named Lauren Salzman. And Lauren basically came to her and said, hey, I've joined something really powerful and I think you could really benefit from it. But it's a huge secret. I need you to commit to keeping a secret. And in order to hear about it, I need you to give me collateral so that I'll know that you won't tell anybody about it. And so she extracts from Sarah, I believe, a naked photo and then some false confessions about what her family members have done. And that's just to hear about it. So now all this is already on the line, and so then she has to give more and more collateral as she hears more and more about what her role in this will be. Eventually it becomes clear that this is a master-slave dynamic where Lauren, her best friend, is now her master. She has to report to her in all kinds of intense ways. I mean, if Lauren says ready, then all of her 6 slaves, including Sarah, have to say ready within a minute or they face consequences. And this group becomes more and more sexualized in a way, like the consequences start being things like paddling each other. And eventually Sarah is essentially coerced and blackmailed into getting branded without anesthesia. So a cauterizing tool was used on her for 30 minutes to create a symbol that was supposedly representing the elements. And the way she got out was, her intuition starting to peak throughout all of this. And then she realizes, holy shit, this isn't a symbol of the elements. This is a symbol of Keith Raniere's initials. So she has this big wake-up moment and finds out then later that women are being recruited into DOS for the purpose of having sex with Keith. So these slaves were being ordered by their masters to go seduce Keith. That is why Keith is now serving 250 years in prison for sex trafficking and racketeering, among other charges. So what's amazing about Sarah is that she went from being in this cult for 12 years of her life. She met her husband there, she met her closest friends there, her career took place in Nxivm, and all of a sudden she is willing to leave all of that and risk her collateral being released in order to get people the fuck out of this cult. She goes to the New York Times. She was front page of the New York Times, showing her brand, which is, I have to imagine a really triggering experience for her. She has gone public as much as she can because the press was basically the biggest weapon against Nxivm, which had taken down so many people who had tried to dissent earlier. And she's just a fucking hero, really. I mean, she recruited a lot of people into Nxivm thinking that she was helping them, and now she has basically dedicated her life to getting people out. The good news is Keith's in prison, as are some of his henchmen, or henchwomen, rather. But that's really due to her and Mark Vicente and a few other people who were courageous enough to leave and to go public and to allow this traumatic experience to be, leered at by the public. And that's something I really can't imagine. I can't imagine having your trauma be a point of fascination for the public and to be hearing nasty things about how they should have been smarter. This guy, Keith, this setup was really convincing, and really, really smart people got pulled into this. So it's just, I think, an important interview to listen to. You'll hear us. She's mainly talking about the various strategies used to brainwash and really get control over the members of this group. And I think that's really relevant to all sorts of people because they've probably experienced some of these same tactics in relationships. She also talks about healing and what that process has been like for her. I honestly would have talked to her for 10 hours. It's it's just, this really kind of goes to the bounds of what we expect from normal human life and psychology. And I'm just really grateful that she was willing to come and talk to us, because I think she's a hero and I have so much respect for her. So I will say, though, if you are looking for more details on Nxivm or about her experience, I would recommend watching The Vow. She's heavily featured in that, and that's on HBO. And I would also recommend her book, Scarred. It's a full account of her experience. It's just really, really great, really powerful, and I would recommend it. So without further ado, let's welcome Sarah Edmondson. All right, Sarah Edmondson, thank you so much for joining us. I am eternally grateful that you're willing to talk about this yet again on a 10 a.m. morning.
My absolute pleasure. I can't seem to shut up, apparently.
Well, I'm glad you're not, because I mean, I know you know how helpful it's been to others. Can you tell us just the briefest kind of overview of what Nxivm was and then what drew you to it?
Sure. Yeah. And I always like to preface this as there's what we thought it was and then what it actually was. Mm-hmm. So what I thought I was getting involved with was a personal and professional development program. I heard about it through a filmmaker who I really liked and respected and wanted to work with. And it seemed to answer a lot of the things, or provide a solution to a lot of the things I was looking for and seeking at the time. I was in my mid-20s. I was at a bit of a crossroads with my career, looking for more meaning. Always been into personal development, trying to be the best version of myself, but also my parents were therapists, so I, was open to that world, and did have a belief that it's possible to grow and to develop yourself and change your belief system. And what I thought Nxivm was, and how it was pitched to me, was basically a tool set or a curriculum that would look at your whole belief system. The term they used was operating system, and give it an upgrade. And in the process of doing that, you'd be part of a community of like-minded humanitarians who were dedicated to evolving themselves and reaching the leadership of the world to help, basically create world peace. Like, that was a huge mission. So it was like on the micro, developing yourself; on the macro, being a part of this community that was of epic proportions. So I laugh because it's so idealistic and preposterous now, but at the same time, at the time, it was a very meaningful, beautiful concept that drew us in.
I did notice, so I read your book, and over again, you mention how Keith would say, like, we're going to change the world. Mm-hmm. We're doing this to change the world. So there always seemed to be this mission, but it was a bit amorphous. Was the mission basically everybody who comes into Nxivm upgrades their systems, and then through that kind of upgrade and self-actualization, then we will interact with others in a healthier, more productive way? Or was there something else?
Well, that's a huge part of it. But I think the idea also is to bring ethics to the world. Okay. We would take this curriculum, and Nancy would say something like, look, imagine if world leaders had this curriculum. Uh-huh. We wouldn't bomb each other. We wouldn't. And that was... And I still actually think this to a degree, that there's these like little boys with big guns protecting their sandbox that are in big bodies. And if they had compassion and thought of the other people on the other side of whatever, territory they're protecting, then we wouldn't have war, because you'd see people as people. And that's a good concept. And the idea, at least in my mind, was, how do we get this curriculum to the world leaders? And we were doing that. Like, the son of the former president of Mexico was the center owner, just like I was a center owner here in Vancouver. He ran the center in Mexico. Wow. So we were reaching high-level people. Keith was talking to the Dalai Lama. We had heads of state, and the president of Enron, when I first joined, had just taken it. So, like... It seemed like that was possible. It wasn't like a total pie in the sky thing.
One thing I noticed was, you said your parents were therapists. I kept watching this through the lens of like, would I be at risk, basically sucked in? Yeah. And what is so attractive about this, and so many of the techniques seemed directly pulled from therapy and then tweaked to make them used for evil. I mean, things like embracing fear, taking nerves to mean you're on the right track, breaking avoidance, getting in touch with your kind of inner physical state with the viscera. In therapy, we would say, if you're experiencing fear, explore that, understand, like, is your fear trying to tell you something important? But if not, maybe take an opposite action and do the opposite of what any given emotion is telling you to do. Here, it seems like he skipped a step and just said, go to opposite action. You're experiencing fear. Go do whatever it's telling you not to do.
His thing was basically, if you feel that viscera, that they defined fear as a lack of information. That there's always a lack of data. So once you have the data, you're not fearful anymore. And so a lot of it was go get the data, but also the like a phrase that was used a lot, or what I've learned in the cult terminology world is a thought terminating cliche. Have you heard that term?
I haven't.
Yeah, so like a thought terminating cliche in this context would be like, if I'm feeling something, they'd say it's just a viscera. Right? Outside this world, like, is what it is what it is a thought terminating cliche. Like, there's no more exploration after is what it is. In this world, if I'm saying, hey, I'm feeling like really uncomfortable that we're asked to give collateral to join this group, they would say, well, you seem reactive, go journal on it. So it's almost like gaslighting mixed with a thought terminating cliche that stops the exploration. So there's a lot of that. But in terms of the fear thing, and Nippy and I have spent a lot of time also on our podcast talking about, like, what's good, where did it come, and we're actually going to do a whole episode just on this, like finding specific tools, what's good about it, and then how can it be tweaked, like you said, how can it be used in a manipulative way, and also where did it come from originally, so we can use the good part of it and not feel like we have to pay tribute and say thank you Vanguard, which is what we have to do for everything. So like you're absolutely right. So much of it did come from therapy. Have you read the book Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach?
Yes.
Tara Brach. Yeah, it's such a good book, right? A lot of the exercises that she does in there, I'm pretty sure Keith like ripped off directly from that book, in terms of like, exercises on building compassion for others. Like we did so many great exercises where they'd say, like, think of an example of someone that you're challenged by, and you'd go through a series of questions and steps, and by the end you feel like you can be friends, you can embrace that person, and you've tried on their perspective from their side, and you've like, you don't feel the same towards them. Like that's a great tool to have, but it's not his.
I was curious about, like, when you were describing all that, and I imagine it's like an immersive experience. What was it like in the initial stages of being in it? Like, how did you feel in yourself? Like, what kind of growth? Looking at the positive, I suppose.
Yes.
Like what?
Well, after I got through the initial skepticism of how cheesy and tacky it all was, which it was, and I decided that I wanted to be a coach, which they nurtured in me very quickly, because I was, what I found out later, like the prime person to rise in the ranks, because I had a big network. I was super social, very vocal about things that I like. I'm outgoing. I'm also petite brunette, which I found out later was Keith's type. Didn't get that far though with him. Let it be known. But yeah, it's funny. I was just talking about this with somebody else recently, and I'd kind of forgotten about this because I was, it's hard to really remember the good. And of course, there was lots of good. But one of the things that when I first became a shadow coach is that they let you basically shadow another coach, and you just sort of sit there and you have to be quiet and keep your state up, and you can't fall asleep, and you can't eat anything, and you're just like trying to learn. And then they start letting you ask questions. And I remember my first intensive where I was allowed to kind of try the methodology, which really was a sort of therapy by numbers, like a paint by numbers series of questions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, some neurolinguistic programming, some Ericksonian hypnosis. Didn't know that at the time, but that's what the package was. And I remember the first time I saw a woman talking about something that she was struggling with, and I remembered something she had said the next day or the previous day. And I said, something like, but how does that relate to and I referenced the thing like the picture that your mom put on the fridge or something like it was something like that. And she had a huge awareness, or in Nxivm we'd call it integration, and a cry. And she had, I was like, oh, it's so true. I was just, I don't know what it was, like looking for love, or like I was just wanting to be validated, like something really basic, right? But for her, it was huge. And for me, it was huge because I thought, oh, wow, like I can do this for somebody, and I had it done for me. I had a number of big integrations, and, and the integrations were things like, it would feel like, wow, I can't believe I almost went through my whole life without knowing that. Mm-hmm. Like how amazing. And it was the way that the curriculum was set up was that it was designed so that you'd have the aha yourself. And from what I had seen in other types of therapies, at least that I'd experienced, is that the therapist would say something like, well, it sounds like blah, 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 and be kind of deductive with it and just tell you. And you'd be like, yeah, that's right. I guess I do have low self-esteem or something, Whereas in this one, in Nxivm, it'd be like, holy shit, I have low self-esteem because, and I'd come up with it myself. And so I think that the ahas that people got were real, and I've since learned this from cult analysis, is that it's called a peak experience. So that in combination with like people watching, especially sometimes there'd be a demo, and I was off in the demo because I'm very expressive at the front of the room in front of like 50 people. And that's like, there's a rush that comes with that. And I think, to feel like you're doing this work with a group of people was very meaningful. And it was very rare that we would get through a 5-day and that like somebody, what I'm trying to say is everyone had a good experience in the 5-day, except for maybe if there was one person that was like dragged there by somebody who was like super closed, or like, their mom paid for it and they were like, fuck this shit, Mm-hmm. But generally people were open. They got a lot out of the 5-day, and it really did feel like a whole, to use their metaphor, an operating system upgrade. Where like communication was, I felt like I really felt like I have got the secret handbook for life on communication and human psychodynamics and self-esteem and money and relationships. And I was just like, boom, I'm on fire. That's the best way I can describe it.
Yeah. I mean, is there a point where if you stop with a Nxivm, then you've just had such a positive, like everything has just been a gift, or was the rot all the way through?
I think it is a kind of a case-by-case basis. There are a lot of people in my community who would say that even the 5-day was toxic, and I think that is true depending on how deep you went with it and what you took from it. Mm-hmm. But I think generally, and I found this out by checking in with people to see if they wanted to, join the class action lawsuit. A lot of people said, you know what, I took the 5-day, got my money's worth. Like, I'm okay, I think it definitely became problematic when people did the 16-day. I know for me, like my 5-day was really positive. The last 11 days was really upsetting for me, actually. Like I felt very stripped away down to nothing, and I didn't know who I was anymore. And I was like really grasping at straws to get my ground again. Mm-hmm. And that was really hard for me. But I also didn't even express that because I felt like I'd done it wrong. So I was like, yeah, this is amazing. I was like crying in the corner. I think that's in my book. But I think, yeah, if people did just the 5-day, they're fine. But some people, like also in the 5-day, is some toxic shit depending on how you use it. Like going back to what you said, what's the good of it? A really good concept is personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. Right? Like something happens in my life, I can go, okay, well, how did I participate in this? Well, I chose the relationship. I did ignore those red flags. I wanted the security, those types of things, right? The negative of that is to beat oneself up. Even if there's no outside structure gaslighting you or like manipulating you like happened with us, someone could take the 5-day and then go on with their life and be like, well, I caused everything in my life. Okay. Mm-hmm. I got abused. Well, I caused it. No, well, okay. You can own your part of it, but also like that guy's an abuser. So get the fuck out, mm-hmm. So that you can the problem is you can take too much responsibility. Mm-hmm. right?
That really stood out because I'm also a proponent of personal responsibility. But the example I think you gave in the book was somebody being hit by a truck and then asking yourself, what's your personal responsibility for that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's and you see it in the extreme with what happened with me and Doss. Like, if I was still fully bought into that doctrine, I wouldn't have spoken out about it, because I would say, well, I did choose to join it, and I said yes. Yeah, I did. I did make those choices, and I fully own it. But I was also lied to.
Yeah.
I was invited to a women's group that was started by a man who was collecting our photos for his spank bank. You know, like, that was a major betrayal. And so, in an episode we did with the prosecutor who took Nxivm down, I highly recommend it. It's my favorite episode with Moira Penza. She's amazing. And she says that, like, the biggest manipulation that she saw after interviewing so many people from Nxivm is just the concept of victimhood, and how that's the best way to manipulate someone is to think that there are no victims. So if I am actually victimized in that framework, for me to say that I've been victimized in the Nxivm framework is I'm the abuser. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Like, that's so problematic. If I say I'm a victim, I'm being abusive in that framework.
Yeah. Interesting.
So it's the ultimate protection of Keith, because he can never do anything wrong.
Right. And so even just listening to you, I mean, this is kind of both of our reactions of, wow, that sounds like there are elements of it that sound so good, right? And there's well-intentioned self-help groups and therapy and even meditation and religious, groups that can seem like this at first with all these kind of elements. What point for you did you notice or had the feeling that this is not okay? This is, you mentioned the 16-day, but were there other aspects that at least for listeners who might be like, I'm joining one of these, like, how do you know from your own experience when it's turned from like a positive to a negative experience?
That's a really good question, and it's been such a big part of my journey to be able to figure that out and, like, hand it to people on a silver platter so they don't have to go through what I went through. And truthfully, if I'd seen The Vow or read my book or any of the books that are coming out more recently, I wouldn't have even signed up. Mm-hmm. Because, and I'm not even talking about, like, leaving on day one. I wouldn't have signed up because one of the biggest red flags was the pressure to sign up and get the discount and, like, not miss the opportunity. And I feel like, had I trusted my gut on that, I wouldn't have even joined. But I also was like, but I really want to do this. And I really liked Mark, and I wanted to work with him, and he was doing it. And okay, it's just a cheesy sales tactic, right? It's a manipulative tactic. And if you take that out of the equation, what are the other things that I think are important is that, if you're feeling, it's so tricky because there's truth in this statement, because one of the things they taught us right at the beginning, and this is also in the book, is if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling that, oh, I want to get out of here, I need to go, like, stuff my face with some muffin or whatever, like the things that we do to cover up our bad feelings, then that means you're doing it right. Mm-hmm. Right? And there is some truth to that. Like, I do really healthy, positive therapy now, and with my husband and couples counseling, and, like, when we get to a point, there's times where I'm like, oh, I can't handle this. Like, we have natural desires to leave, but that's different than a gut instinct that something's not right. And those two things are very confusing. If you've agreed in advance to stick it out when you're uncomfortable, then there's no protective mechanism. There's no back door. Even for me, cut to 12 years later when I joined the women's group, now I'm operating on a premise that all women are flaky and always looking for the back door. I can't leave because I can't be a flaky, this is my commitment on the line. This is like what it means to be a strong woman and overcome all of my challenges is to stick it out. So it went from, like, you can't, the dismantling of our gut instinct started on day one, like, of the 5-day. Right? So by the time the DOS came around, I mean, now people understand, I think, how it can get to that. But to answer your question, let me give you a couple things. I think if there's a person at the helm who can't be questioned, and you were really on point with your gaslighting episode, because there, because of the authority structure in Nxivm and the ranking system, if somebody above you has feedback for you or in any way is above you in that system, you can't say anything negative because they always know better, right? And that's a real problem because you're there to grow, and you're kind of, and it is normal in a teaching setting that the person that's teaching you knows more. That's why you're there. So when they say something like, well, you're just doing your pattern. The fact you want to leave right now is that's why you came, right? You paid money. So if you're feeling that you need to leave and you can't, and they're using that against you, I mean, that's a hard place to go, to be strong enough to say, no, this isn't the right fit for me. Because you're already if you've bought into the doctrine or the dogma in any way, if you leave, you're weak. Mm-hmm. You're never going to work through your shit. So, I mean, I think you can have a healthy structure where someone is above you and knows more than you, but that person has to be accountable to other people. There has to be some
that's what I found
checks and balances.
So striking was that there's this mantra of personal responsibility, and yet as soon as you're above somebody else, there's suddenly no more responsibility. Mm-hmm. Like you would, talk to people and say how uncomfortable you were, or how you were feeling exploited, for instance, for not being promoted for like 4 years or something to the order staff, and they would just say, "Oh, it's your fault." There's no responsibility taken for the upper rungs. Did you ever fall into that yourself, or did you see how that happened?
Yeah. I think I'm pretty sure that I did in the most well-intentioned ways, and that came out a couple of times with people after we left who were like, you gaslit me too. And I had to go to my therapist and my cult therapist and be like, am I abusive? Mm-hmm. And what I came to for me, and what that might sound like for me is probably like the example I just said. Like, let's say you come to me and you're like, I'm really upset that I haven't been promoted. And I might say like, yeah, you seem really invested. You seem really attached to it. Like, why don't you journal on it and see what that attachment's about? Like in my heart of hearts, I know that I am a good person and I was still trying to help them grow. And as my therapist helped me see, in an abusive regime where the leader is abusive, the tactics used to trickle down are all going to be abusive because that's what we're taught. So I didn't think I was being abusive. I thought I was teaching her to go internal and figure out why she wanted it so badly.
Yeah.
Because that's that kind of thing. Or like, there's a lot of double binding. Double binding would be like, if you didn't want to come to a training, and sometimes we did this in more of a joking way, like, well, I guess if, growing yourself and humanity is not important to you, then don't come. Right? Like that whole thing. And Nippy and I, my husband and I, we still do that in a joking way. Like, mm-hmm. I guess if the marriage is not important, then just stay home. No problem.
There's so much about agency and consent, right? And there was something that struck me about reading articles about, talking to officials about this and having some trouble reporting it because someone's like, well, you went into this willingly, right? Mm-hmm. And now hearing this, I'm like, where is the consent? Where is your choice in all of this? Did you feel like a lot of agency or a lack of it, or how does that even play in?
I mean, I think that's also the sort of level of Keith's really spectacular evil manipulation is that he always made things look consensual and that people were asking for it. Like, even on day 1 of our 5-day, we were supposed to say on a level of 1 to 10, 1, I'm here to observe. 10 is give me all the feedback. Like, I'm here to learn. Tell me everything you see. And we'd always get someone to go first who was like really enthusiastic and be like, I'm a 10. Or of course, I'm like, I'm an 11. There was always one of me. It was some keener at the front row. Wait, are you guys American or Canadian?
American.
So we're American, but my fiance is Canadian, so I know the term keener.
You know the word keener. Okay, because I just explained that to somebody. They're like, what's a keener? I'm like, you don't know what a keener is? It must be Canadian. Keener.
I've adopted it. It's a great word.
A keen person in the front row is a keener. Goody two shoes, whatever you want to call it. So that was me. I wanted to be a good student. I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
agency and like
agency,
choice.
yeah.
And yeah.
I mean, I felt so much agency in, I would say, probably my first 5 or 6 years. You know, I felt like I felt so much potential, so much, and it was also really glamorous. Like, you got to remember, my first Jeunesse training as a facilitator, I got picked up in a private jet and flown to Alaska. Mm-hmm. You know, we flew to Mexico and for a show that the center was putting on there about the cartel situation, and I was driving around in armored cars with bodyguards because it's like the son of the former president, and you know, trips, like it was really fun and exciting and elite and glamorous. And also we were doing this like deep introspective work. We really thought that we were pretty righteous too. You know, we really thought we were like everything and everything else. And I had such a disdain for actual therapy, not realizing that I was using like therapy in a repackaged format.
So you're talking about the first 5 to 6 years, you felt an immense amount of agency.
Yeah.
In your book, you talk both about periods where you felt so happy, you felt like you were thriving. And then at other times you talk, and I think sometimes about the same, like at your wedding, you're saying that everybody looked overly happy and that they were kind of plastic smiles plastered on all the Espians. Was the happiness real? At what point did it just transition into something different?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for everybody else because I don't know, but I think for me, I felt like it was real. Like when I think back to my wedding, I think that generally the community was really thriving at that time. And I think the perspective of the plastic and all that was what in retrospect, how I experienced people who weren't in Nxivm looking at us would think.
Okay.
You know, and maybe that wasn't super clear in the book, but it was a hard thing to communicate the different like levels, especially as I got out, like when I thought of things retrospectively, how it must have looked. But for me, I was genuinely really happy, but there were things that came up, and I talk about in the book that were problematic, but I didn't have anywhere to put it. Because even in my circle of friends who were all lower ranking than me in the community, I couldn't tell them because you can't, then I'd be expressing negativity, something I've since learned in a term that's quite popular now, the toxic positivity, right? Like I had to be, everything was great all the time.
Yeah.
And if I did go up to my upline or my coach or my sponsor, then I would be complaining, which was, back to your gender question, that was another female negative trait was to complain. So if you had anything negative to transmit, it would be noted as a complaint. So like you couldn't, then what do you do with things that aren't working? You can't. You just, and so that's like the gaslighting was sort of built in as part of like the protective mechanism of Keith. And also there's a whole module about speaking honorably about somebody. You know, like speaking dishonorably would be like, oh, he's a total douche, versus, well, in my experience, we did business and I found that sometimes he was difficult to communicate with, like there's a way to transmit something about somebody that's more kind, right? And there's truth in that, but you can't, but in that system, you can't say anything negative about Keith or the leadership because then you're speaking dishonorably and you're not paying tribute to what the person's built, or you're just having a reaction.
Tell us more about then, we're kind of going into it, but the transition from that positivity to like, you're starting to feel negative emotions underneath, couldn't express them. Tell us about the descent. Tell us about what it felt like to be like, I don't know about this.
Yeah. See, I was so in the hamster wheel of the go, go, go and the build, build, build and the fill, like we had to fill the trainings. And always trying to stay above water financially too, because the commitment was huge, that I don't think I was actually still enough to really connect with the fact that I wasn't happy with a lot of things. And Nippy and I didn't even really talk about it till after we got out, how relieved we were, but because we hadn't expressed to each other how dissatisfied we were, actually. And I think that started around the time that I gave birth to my son, so it was like 3 years before I left. And there was a lot of things that happened around that time. Like they started all these new programs, and they took like half of my coaches from Vancouver, so I had to rebuild the structure. Like I couldn't provide my students with coaching, which is what the whole thing is. And I was just like, why are like I felt so sabotaged. But every time I was like, hey guys, can you not take like, and they'd be like, don't you want your staff to work with Keith? You know, why would you take that experience away from them? I'm like, but we have a business that like, it just wasn't sustainable anything that we were doing. So by the time I gave birth to Troy, I was like, oh, like my priorities shifted. And I can't remember if this is in the book or not, but I was a 3-stripe orange at that time when I gave birth. I needed one more stripe and then I'd get promoted to green, which is what I was working towards. And at that V week, when I had like a newborn, I had a 3-month-old baby, they promoted me to green. Like they skipped a sash. So
that is in the book, by the way.
It is in the book? Okay. Yes. See, I haven't read it in a couple of years. Like that was called a motivational promotion. It wasn't a promotion that I had earned, even though like I was ready for a long time and they were dragging me along. But there were a bunch of criteria I still had to work through, but they gave it to me to keep me in. So they were pretty good at like knowing when people were like, fuck this, you know? Uh-huh. So Nippy and I were both quite dissatisfied, I think. Sorry, your question was when did I start to feel?
Yeah, like the experience of the turn, right? The turn of the doubting and kind of listening to those feelings. And
yeah, so a term or a metaphor I love to use a lot is that and I see this across the board now in my cult recovery, talking to other people like ex-Mormons and ex-everything, is that as they're waking up, it's not necessarily one thing. It's like they have an experience. It's like, ugh, and they shelve it. They put it on the shelf. And the same thing with abusive relationships, right? You have, he says something undercutting, and you're like, well, but you give them the benefit of the doubt and you shelve it. And I guess, truthfully, I was shelving things since day one, but it was always overridden by, but the community, but Mark said, like, stick it out, and then, but we're building this, and then things would be like, well, I'm paying like a $7,000 rent and a 5-year lease for my center. Like, I'm so tunnel vision that we got to make it work. I'm ignoring a lot of red flags or shelving them, is another way. So basically, shelving is a metaphor for ignoring red flags or putting them aside because you can't wrap your head around it. Mm-hmm. And I know this is in the book. There's a number of times where I was like, is Keith? No, he can't be. Like, they wouldn't want to have sex with him because he's a garden gnome. and he's can't do that because he's the therapist. Like, that's totally inappropriate. Oh, and I've been told that he's a celibate renunciate. Anyway, so those things on the shelf just got more and more and more, and things went really sideways once I was in DOS. So once I joined the women's group and was, collateralized, which all those details are in the book, how I got into that, why I committed, and basically how I was blackmailed to do something I didn't want to do. And ultimately the biggest wake up, even when I was in DOS, I was like, this isn't right. I got to get out of this. Like, shit, this is not what I signed up for. And especially when Lauren was like, once I'd committed, said I need to give new collateral every month. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, that wasn't what I signed up for. She's like, no, you signed up for a vow of obedience. So you're supposed to do whatever I say. I'm like, but you said that was going to be things for my growth, not to like keep me more and more. And then I was supposed to give my deed to my home. That was a major red flag. So at this point, I'm like, not just shelving it. I'm like, now I'm aware of the shelf and I'm just trying to figure out what to do. And it was my conversation with Mark Vicente and then realizing that the symbol on my body wasn't a symbol for the elements, but it was actually Keith's initials. I mean, that whole thing just caused the shelf to collapse. And I woke up very quickly and was like, suddenly very aware that anything I'd ever heard negative about us or that anyone had ever said that I was maybe in a cult was 100% accurate and had to get out. So that part of my journey was incredibly challenging, stressful, PTSD triggering, all of those things. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
tell us a little bit about the gender dynamics. You mentioned a couple times, and also in the vow and the book, there's a lot about Nxivm and DOS that's about how women relate to men and vice versa. How did that feel? Like, what was your experience of that as a woman there? And
it's the same thing with the Nxivm. It's like what we thought we were doing and then what we were actually doing. And at the beginning, keep in mind, I started doing jeunesse a year after I started Nxivm. So that was 2006. And then we did like a co-ed jeunesse around 2010, and then the SOP around 11 or 12, and then the co-ed SOP, Society of Protectors. So that was a backdrop throughout my whole time there. And at the beginning, jeunesse was it was like, great, I get to do this introspective work just with women, and we get to talk about sex and, our different wirings around it. And it was generally very positive, and also very positive for Nippy and I before we got married. And it's just like with the ESP or the Nxivm curriculum, there was lots of good stuff there. And then there was the toxic, misogynistic, really dated stuff that it wasn't presented to us like it was more under the guise of like, let's look at our current world and figure out how to evolve it. And while we're looking at it, reinforcing them. Like, it wasn't obvious to us that it was misogynistic. We thought we were looking at misogyny. I thought we were like breaking it apart, but we were actually reinforcing certain things. So, I learned some dynamics that I thought were helpful in my relationship, but were actually very backwards, and so I had to, Nippy and I had to do a lot of work. We're still doing it, looking at our roles and our beliefs around gender and who we are as men and women and how we want to relate to each other. So it's an ongoing, very difficult journey because our heads got fucked with for pretty much the whole time we were there about those issues.
So what has healing been like? I mean, what are the different pieces? So you and Nippy are working on gender roles. It sounds like some sort of couples therapy. You're in therapy for trauma, I would imagine.
Yeah. I actually have I've developed a 6-point healing plan. Wonderful. Yeah. I shared it with some ex-Mormons in Salt Lake City a couple of weeks ago. Apparently our journey is very similar. The first one was just self-care. And for me, that also meant safety. Like I had to make sure I put extra locks on the doors and just making sure that my family was safe. Self-care being a lot of baths, hot baths. I take a lot of CBD oil. I also like microdosing mushrooms, not to be high, but just for anxiety. There was a time when I was actually on Ativan for about a month, just to like get my system to reset because I was so wired from the PTSD. And then self-education. So like for me, there's a ton of books that I love. One's called Take Back Your Life by Janja Lalich. I actually ended up narrating the Audible because for me as a PTSD / survivor, I couldn't even read. Like I wasn't able to pick up a book and read. I couldn't sit still. So I begged her to let me narrate it. And now I tell other people who have reached out to me, I'm like, just don't read the book, just listen to the narration because it's easier to take in that way. And yeah, therapy. So it took me a while to find the right therapist. I had a cult specialist, which I think is really important, someone who understands abusive dynamics and narcissists, because a lot of like just regular therapists looking at something like this don't know what to not do. You know what I mean? And I found a lot of our ex-students went to a regular therapist and were, asked questions that were very triggering because it was in the same kind of format as what Nxivm did.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Like what? Yeah. Just so us trainees can
yeah. So like a really standard therapeutic question is, what do you mean? Right?
And then what does that mean to you? Or
yeah. So
what do you make it mean?
What do you make it mean? So, I mean, it's an elicitation question. You say like, oh, I'm feeling really stressed, or like I don't like how he did that, or whatever. Like, well, what do you mean? Like you're trying to get more information. If I were to say, my husband didn't bring me flowers or something, the response was, well, what do you make that mean? Mm-hmm. Well, I make it mean that he doesn't love me. Well, why do you make it mean that?
Yeah.
Could it be anything else? Like, it's the tone as well. You know, what are you making that mean? Like, what meaning are you putting on it? This is your fault. But that's ultimately the gaslighting too, right? Like, anything I'm upset about, someone can say, get an EM. You're just upset, get an exploration of meaning. And so to have a therapist and I said this in my talk, the first time I told a therapist, and it wasn't even in a therapy session, it was a family member who was dating a therapist, and I told them kind of briefly what had happened, and he said, that sounds really awful. That sounds so painful. I can't, wow, what a story, you know? And no one had ever said that to me in Nxivm for 12 years. If I said something bad had happened to me, they'd say, well, any version of like, well, how did you cause yourself to be there? Right? Or like, what expectations in reality were you not aware of? So it always comes back to something that I did, right? And to have someone be like, wow, that's really awful. I started crying as soon as he said it, because I was like, yeah, it was really awful. Thank you for acknowledging that. It was really fucking awful with the last 12 years of my life, knowing what I know now, you know?
Yeah.
So finding a therapist that like won't trigger you takes time, I think. And I Nippy and I see a great couples therapist. I still every now and then, not so much recently, but have a couple of cult experts that I call on. Saw somebody for trauma, a lot of body work. To get the like stress and adrenaline out of my body. And for me also, I have to exercise. Like I have to walk and or do yoga. I have a whole, like a large part of my day is just like taking care of my body and making sure that the stress is out. I do go to stress pretty easily. Like I don't handle stress well. Yeah. So I know that about myself. So I have to make sure that I like do all the things. Okay, so we got self-care, self-education, therapy. Oh, and then reclaiming my values and my time was a really key part of my healing process. And to go like the moment where I cleared my calendar of all the recurring things that I was obligated to be a part of, and all of a sudden was like, I have my time back. What do I want to do? And figure out what I liked again. And then reestablishing new traditions with my family. We have like Saturday pancakes, and we go to the farmers market, and we go for walks in the woods, and we just never had time to do any of that. And I mean, truthfully, having kids has been really important in my healing, because I didn't have them to heal, but it helped me to heal because I couldn't wallow for too long in the depressed, dark space. I had to pull up my bootstraps and get out of that very quickly. Now, I only said 4 things. I can't remember the other 2 right now. Reclaiming my time. I don't know. It's gone from my mind.
It's okay.
It'll come back to me. But those are some key things for sure.
Those are fabulous. And so you're talking about reclaiming your values. One thing I noticed, you wrote a diary entry that's at the end of your book that says, you were never broken, you were always whole and complete. I have a personal kind of pet peeve with people, with this idea that people are broken, and people saying like, I'm just totally broken. So I love that you said this, that was never even true to begin with. And yet the mission of Nxivm in a way was this idea of self-actualization. Do you have ideas about about self-actualization now, whether that's a thing, whether that's something to strive for?
I mean, I find that whole concept and the industry built around it is so gross, personally, that I feel like it's just so icky that there's that even just the fact that we wear makeup, like that we're not okay as we are is problematic. But here I am with my lipstick on.
It's okay.
Because like. It actually was said in Nxivm, and it's part that, and I love that you brought that up. It is a little bit of a fuck you to them, because they would even say you're whole and complete, but at the same time making you feel like shit so that you take more training, right? So it was a bait and switch. I mean, all cults and abusive relationships, MLMs, in my opinion, are a bait and switch. You're signing up for one thing, and it's actually another thing. Right, so they're saying we're going to self-actualize you, or put you on a path to living your best life, whatever that means for you. but at the same time, we're going to undercut you and expose all your perceived weaknesses and deficiencies so that you feel like you are broken, so that you can pay money for a curriculum that will make you whole, even though you already are whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So any Nxivm person who's still loyal to Keith would read that and go, but that's what Nxivm was saying, that you are whole and complete. Yeah, that's what they're saying, but that's not what they're doing. Mm-hmm. What they're doing is very different than what they're saying. And that's the other kind of red flag, back to your earlier question, Kirby, is like, what are one of the major red flags is when there's an inconsistency that doesn't make sense. And if you ask somebody about it, you're shut down. Mm-hmm. You know, like this is another one that just popped into my mind. This is a success program. You're supposed to be achieving your goals and dreams. I was one of those people who was doing that. I was setting goals and reaching them, having a home that overlooks the water. I was getting that. And then getting in shit because if I didn't want to move to Albany and get rid of my apartment here in Vancouver, I was too attached to materialism.
Yeah.
You know, like that doesn't make sense. You know, and everyone who had joined Nxivm and moved to Albany had given up all their goals and dreams. So like, what are we doing here? And so if you see things that just don't add up, that doesn't, like, they're saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Oh, I have 1 million more questions. I was just curious about what you've seen has worked in terms of getting other people out.
Oh, go with that one.
I'll tell you what hasn't worked.
Okay.
I mean, truthfully, I think the best way, I can't get anybody else out anymore because anyone who's still in hates me with a passion because I'm the one, you know, I destroyed the community. They see me as the villain. So there's nothing that's going to come out of my mouth that will be helpful to them. I think other people are able to get other people out because they hold true to a compassionate, loving, open arms response of I'm here, you know, and people need somewhere to go when they wake up. Mm-hmm. And if they come back to their family who's like, see, I told you so, you were in a cult, I've been telling you all along, that's not welcoming.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I've dealt with that too. And, you know, I don't have close relationships with those people because it doesn't feel good. And I would say that anyone who wants to get somebody out of anything is just to not distance, like stay close, as close as you can. Ask loving, curious questions. Mm-hmm. Don't tell them they're in a cult. Suggest our podcast. You hear this podcast a little bit culty? It's so funny, all these things that are culty these days. It's crazy. Have you heard it? I don't know. I know that I really screwed up at the beginning with a lot of people because I was so angry. Mm-hmm. And in the Nxivm world, if I'm angry, then there's a problem, and I need to get an EM. And if I had gone to them with how I feel now and how grounded I am now, with like, okay, well, so here's what happened. You know, Keith had a harem of women. He lied about it. He started a personal development program as a means to get more women in his harem. You know, like I could lay it out in a very non-reactive way, but my reactivity shot me in the foot because in our doctrine and our whole system, that meant that there was something wrong, right? So anyway, I think being loving is really key. And if I could go back and be more loving with those people at the beginning, I probably would have gotten more people out. But we did get like literally hundreds, if not thousands, out of Nxivm. So, and they're still coming. People are still waking up to this day.
Is there still a Nxivm that's operating?
There's no Nxivm that's operating. There's a small community of people who think that Keith is imprisoned unjustly, and that, you know, all the people in the vow, are, myself included, are just doing this for the book deal. Mm-hmm. It's just really so rewarding. It's really funny, actually.
I mean, our last question is, you know, you're talking about what to do to get people. Are there any other like resources, or you know, we'll put your book on our website for people to find. But if there's anything else that you would say, here are resources or things to look into, or you'd like people to check out or delve into more.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I left, Bonnie, Mark, the person who recruited me, his wife left before us, and she put together this list, which I've since added to, and it's on my website. at sarahedmondson.com/resources. And all the books that I mentioned and all these TV shows and therapists that I personally endorse are on there. So, and also on there is, I think it's there, I should double check, is I Got Out, hashtag I Got Out, which is a movement of people who are getting out of cults, abusive anythings, and using the hashtag to unite people online, blow the lid off the shame and the stigma around these things, because I really do think that in 2005, the main reason I joined is because I didn't have all this information, and now this is the golden age of cult awareness, and people are waking up to it and not joining because so much of this is out there. And I got out as more of a community for the recovery process, which is really key. Because if you don't feel ashamed about it, then you can talk about it, and then other people can learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, we'll let you go.
Thank you so much. This was so amazing. We were so excited to have you, and this was just
my pleasure.
Glowing.
Yeah, no, I love these kind of these are my favorite kind of conversations. So we'll do more, and
I'm thrilled we can continue it. And I would love to know whether Nippy comes back with some flowers today, or whether he doesn't actually love you.
I'm pretty sure he doesn't love me, and there's no flowers. It's okay.
That sounds so awful.
I'm whole and complete. I don't need anything from the outside world for my happiness.
By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.